The Buddha did talk a lot about the practice in two ways, in a positive one and in a negative one too. But please do not confuse those two words with the conventional meaning. Positive and negative mean something different here. One part of the training deals with the cultivation of positive and wholesome qualities, and the other part deals with the restraint and non-doing of certain and all negative qualities, unwholesome qualities. While the Buddha did teach both, you might have wondered why we on this channel usually choose to emphasize the negative qualities a bit more. Today, we hopefully shed some light on why it might be better, at least for beginners, to focus on the negative aspects of the practice first, especially in the beginning of the practice. But before we begin, I like to give you an example or two of both positive and negative kinds of practice. Let us start with the positive kind, or the cultivation kind. Well, positive practice means that you try to cultivate or achieve something. Those things could, for example, be the 7 factors of awakening or the 5 spiritual potentials or powers. You try to cultivate them in a somewhat structured manner. However, in modern terms, this is usually portrayed as a development of virtue or concentration, which is precisely not an active practice, according to the suttas, if you go by the definitions and explanations there. And this brings us to the other kind of practice, which is a negative kind. And this kind of practice includes restraint and undoing of problematic qualities like views or understandings, or simply your behaviors. You also have to purify your actions, as the Buddha repeatedly says in all the suttas, basically. And in being virtuous, you undo your unwholesome qualities and pull the leash on the mind, so to speak, whenever it tries to enter a territory that is unwholesome and thus bad for you, because you have to suffer the consequences of an unruly mind. You always suffer when the mind enters the central domain. It might not feel like suffering right now because you have not probably fully understood what suffering even is, but in the end, you have to suffer. And samadhi, on the other hand, would be the culmination of virtue, where such qualities, such negative, unwholesome qualities, are no longer present in the mind. And you may let the now trained mind roam freely. And such a state is very free, very light, very pleasant. However, it is important to know about the right kind of non-doing. It is precisely a non-doing of everything related to greed, aversion, and delusion or distraction, which can seem very active to the outside. Yet in the same way, what looks very inactive from the outside can be very active on the inside. So you have to be very careful here, as you cannot judge those qualities from the outside when just observing someone. Someone is sitting somewhere meditating. They can seem like they are fully blissed out or something like that, while being very active. The mind is going after things, as an example. And this is not the practice that the Buddha was talking about. The Buddha always talked about the abolishment, the eradication of craving, and its multiple ways of phrasing it, like greed, aversion, and delusion, all the 5 hindrances. Interestingly, when the Buddha laid down the training, he always started with the negative aspects of training, unless the trainee was already very skilled and very developed in mind. If they already had a very tamed mind, the Buddha started with something else. And to give you an idea, we can start with basically any random sutta. The stock phrase is always the same, or along the same lines, let's put it like that, and the respective training can last a very long time. And the Buddha pretty much said, in that case, bhikkhus, purify the very beginning of wholesome states. And what is the very beginning of wholesome states? Here, bhikkhu dwell restrained by the restraint of the patimokkha, accomplished in good conduct and proper resort, seeing danger in the slightest fault. Having undertaken the training rules, train in them. When, bhikkhu, you dwell restrained by the restraint of the patimokkha, seeing danger in the slightest fault, then, based upon virtue, established upon virtue, you should develop the 4 establishment of mindfulness. So as you can see, there are certain preconditions that you have to fulfill, bring to the table for you to even start developing mindfulness. Because in the end, mindfulness means remembering, and you can only remember what you have understood. And virtue is kind of a precondition for understanding the Dhamma. So you can only really recall and remember the Dhamma when you have understood it, namely attained the right view. But anyway, as you can see from that example, you can only really start working on the very beginning of wisdom and concentration once you are quite advanced in virtue, have a lot of discipline, have a lot of patience, and have dismantled a good number of your wrong understandings and views. And as the suttas say, even the 4 foundations of mindfulness are the prerequisites for right concentration if you continue reading this sutta. So it is very advanced training in most cases, simply because the Buddha was living at a time that was very well suited for spiritual development, and there were many advanced practitioners. But the same is not necessarily true nowadays. We are, on average, very swamped in sensuality. Our entire lives and our entire culture revolve around sensuality. And thus the cultivation aspect is for quite advanced practitioners. After all, mindfulness society means memory, as I said before, or remembering. And you can only really remember those things that you have understood and seen for yourself. Or in short, at least when you are mainly on your own, cultivation depends on the right view. If you are with a noble Sangha that you can trust, you can be a bit more open in your attempts to cultivate. But you must listen to your more advanced members, or you will make mistakes. Well, in the end, you will always make mistakes. They cannot be avoided. But your advanced noble friends can correct your behavior. This is the power of the Sangha, so to speak. And the Buddha pretty much defined the right view as knowing right as right and wrong as wrong. As such, any type of cultivation you engage in is at least to some degree flawed, because you do not yet know right as right and wrong is wrong when you have not made a breakthrough to the Dhamma, the Four Noble Truths, and dependent origination. As a result, you must first undo as many of your obstructive mental qualities and views as you can first. Otherwise, the chances to go astray are pretty high. I would say they are pretty much 100%. Thus, the more you lack in virtue, the more guidance you would need, and you have to trust in your noble companions that they correct you. But nowadays, most traditions are not really leading you towards liberation and more towards calm and pleasant states right now that are disconnected from the Four Noble Truths. So if you put or have to rely on putting your faith in those traditions, you might not end up at full liberation. And again, you either need a noble Sangha, or you have to have very solid sutta knowledge and great self-honesty, great patience, and a very dedicated mind that practices Dhamma as a matter of vital concern. Otherwise, it will not really work. And just to give you a few examples of how things may go wrong, so that we do not have to look very far, as modern practices are full of negative examples, sadly. And the simplest example would be concentration meditation, where the trainee tries to cultivate the qualities that the suttas mention in association with jhana, as an example. They list quite a number of factors like piti and sukha and one-pointedness and many other things. And as unskilled practitioners will likely try to cultivate those things in isolation, and they can only go wrong in doing so. You need the preconditions. Otherwise, whatever you cultivate is not what the Buddha was talking about. Only within the context of the Four Noble Truths, when you have done all the virtue work, have abandoned all the unskillful qualities, will you truly attain those qualities that the Buddha was describing. You can have all of those qualities without having anything to do with actual wisdom or the path. The practice must really happen in the right context of the Four Noble Truths, based on the right preconditions. And not only that, but this kind of cultivation can not only go wrong in one way, but basically infinitely many ways. The number of wrong views is infinite. It is unlimited. For every text that contains the actual Dhamma, you can find countless interpretations that are the exact opposite. This is especially problematic when there is no longer a tradition of cutting small corners and only giving cues instead of actual Dhamma talks. You can give cues as an example. It's not really a problem. But when people start mixing up those cues with the actual Dhamma, then it becomes very problematic, because it might have worked with the direct descendants of noble ones. Then the cues might work. But then the following generation will likely start confusing those cues with the actual instructions. And then you will, if you, for example, want to grow a mango and want a ripe mango, you probably do not bring the necessary patience to the table to wait until it turns ripe on its own. You will start painting it yellow and red. And this is very problematic, because then you have manufactured your joy, you have manufactured your calm and all those things. But you did so devoid of the Four Noble Truths. When the seed, your understanding, is wrong, as the sutras say, then whatever comes out of that seed, out of that wrong view, will also be wrong and only ripen in suffering. Yeah. So the errors accumulate, and in the end, you get something that is not even remotely Dhamma. And as a result, people nowadays try to get and achieve in meditation and try to cut corners everywhere. They try to shortcut the process. In the sutras, meditation comes last. The Buddha called meditation when you are free from greed, aversion, and delusion. Nowadays, we try to put meditation at the front of the training, which is not exactly in line with the sutras. On the contrary, the negative kind of practice can only really go wrong in one or two ways, as opposed to unlimited sources for errors that the active kind of practice without the right view can bring. In practicing restraint on various levels and undoing your wrong views, you can only really have two outcomes. Either you succeed at stopping something or you do not, but the feedback is immediate and visible, and it is difficult to fool yourself. Alternatively, and this is very rare, you can also overdo the restraint part, but I do not think I ever encountered such a practitioner nowadays. We are more prone to sensuality than ever before, and blind asceticism isn't much of a problem really. So yeah, ultimately the practice is about laying down the burden of karma, which is another word for stopping activities on the mental level, which is yet another phrasing for stopping craving. It is all about craving and suffering. You no longer do things and instead allow things to happen. You cultivate the special kind of neutral karma that leads to no longer producing new existence. You no longer want to be triggered into action or being by your senses and cravings. In a sense, one could even argue that virtue and, well, higher virtue, which is based on the right view, are a complete practice. And in Anguttara Nikaya number 11.2, the Buddha even mentioned that a person who has cultivated the negative qualities, there isn't even a real need to form a wish for certain positive qualities to arise. It is only natural for those qualities to arise and come into being. Essentially, all the factors of awakening will naturally arise in such a person, one after another, without having to do anything at all. The Buddha even went as far as saying that there aren't many qualities that assist in final liberation as dwelling in a state where no negative qualities persist. So based on the right view, you can just do nothing at all and would end up at liberation. Yet the other positive qualities will naturally come if you do not prevent them from coming. And this is very important. And just to make the video or talk complete, let us also briefly dive into how to do those things rightly. Right practice always has a certain order. While there are few noteworthy exceptions, you need to firmly establish yourself in virtue and sense restraint and all those things. Let's say self-honesty and as well responsibility, discipline, and patience. If you miss any of those, progress is either outright impossible or only possible given circumstances that include extraordinary suffering as a motivating factor that makes Dhamma practice a vital concern. Thus, you really make an effort to purify the mind of craving, to not want, to cultivate the perception of sensuality, having no true value. You really want to undermine the value of sensuality as a whole and not just in some things. It's not just drugs that are problematic, also heavenly kinds of pleasures that seem quite wholesome for most people, people that are not practicing Dhamma. Even there, you have to undermine the ultimate value. And based on that, the right view can arise, which unlocks all the other aspects of the practice, especially the positive one. And just to make this very clear, in the West, we kind of inverted the order of practice towards starting with what actually comes second. While it can sometimes work, it is usually a bad idea. Meditation as we know it is an abiding for very advanced practitioners. When in questions, Buddha encouraged us to lean a bit more towards asceticism than necessary, just to be sure, because in the beginning, pretty much everything is motivated by craving. It does not hurt too much if you say no, so to speak, to a bit more things than necessary, but it very much hurts to say no to too few things. Sadly, I cannot bring the sutta to mind where I read it, but maybe someone in the comments can remember what I'm talking about. Many people here have very solid sutta knowledge. But anyway, let us now come to the most important point. Dhamma practice has two aspects, a negative and a positive one. Restraint comes first, and cultivation comes second. While there are noteworthy exceptions where it can work without too many restraint at first, that person still has to do the restraint. It always has to come at some point. But anyway, without a solid undoing of obstructive qualities, it is very difficult to end up at the true Dhamma. Negative practice has a much smaller chance to go wrong, if you are on your own especially, and always focus on that before the right view has arisen in you. With the right view, there can be a lot of cultivation going on, because now you have direct feedback if something is right or wrong. Before that, you're pretty much in the dark. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy what I do, feel free to like and subscribe and do all the YouTube things. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.